Bom, gente, eu sou Marli Monteiro de Carvalho, coordenadora do Laboratório de Gestão de Projeto, e hoje nós estamos dando início aos fóruns de 2015. A gente fez um recesso de dezembro para cá, e hoje nós estamos voltando com o professor David Beneth, que é professor emérito da Aston University, lecionou lá por 3 décadas, agora está na Suécia, e vai falar para a gente sobre uma indústria tão combalida nesse início de ano, que é a indústria automobilística. Vai apresentar casos na Austrália, na China, tem uma experiência muito grande nesse setor industrial. So, David, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you here with us. Please, now it's your time to...
Okay, thank you, Marli. Bom dia. I'm struggling to try and learn some Swedish, and I'd learned a few words of Portuguese from my previous visits, but now my Swedish has kind of swamped it, so I'm now struggling when I come back to São Paulo. So thank you, Marli, for this invitation to talk to the forum this evening. I won't thank you for the short notice you gave me. Because I had to think fairly quickly about a topic to talk about. And as you know, Marli, I've been retired for a couple of years, so I don't have any big ongoing research projects that perhaps I've had in the past and that some of my colleagues have got. But I thought it might be interesting to actually combine 2 things together that I've been working on over the last couple of years, because I'm only semi-retired, and as you can see from the first slide, I'm currently working for Chalmers University in Sweden, in Gothenburg, on a part-time basis, and therefore I'm still developing some case studies and still doing a little bit of hobby research, if I can call it that. And what I thought I would do is to bring 2 things together. One, a case study that I developed over the last few years, mainly for teaching purposes, and another very small research study that I've done. And they're both related to the automotive industry, and they both have a common theme in that they are to do with acquisition projects. They're obviously actually quite big things. I mean, when you look at the companies involved and the issues involved, we could be talking for a week on this. But with only a 45-minute slot, I thought I would just focus in on some of the specific technology transfer, product development and quality implications of the 2 cases. Well, that's kind of teased you a little bit, because you now want to know what the cases are. The first one might be a little bit familiar to some of you, because it's actually the acquisition of Tritec Motors Limitada by Fiat Powertrain Technologies. I've put some case timelines in the 2 cases, and the beginning of the case for this one is 1996, which was when Tritec was established by BMW and Chrysler. And I finished this case, well, in fact, it's a kind of an ongoing case. You'll see at the bottom that I've actually said that this has been developed with Breno Nunes, who's working at Aston University, my former university. Some of you probably already know Breno. He actually did a presentation to this forum last November on innovation and sustainability. And we've developed this case specifically for teaching with students. We started it at Aston. Probably it's about 10 years old now, and we're updating it every year. I'm now using it at Chalmers, and Breno continues to use it at Aston. The other case that I'm using for comparison is the Volvo Car Corporation and the acquisition by the Zhejiang Geely Holding Group, the Chinese company that has bought that company. Volvo Car Corporation is a Swedish company. Its headquarters are actually in Gothenburg, and that's why I've got a specific interest in that, because it's in the same city that Chalmers University is located. I've actually started this case in 1999, which was when Volvo Cars was actually acquired by the Ford Motor Company. So it's had 2 rounds of acquisition, if you like, one in 1999 and then one later on. And this one we've again finished in 2015. I put a couple of names down there. Zhongru Li from National Chung Ching University, which is in Taiwan actually, it's not in China, and Michel Le Sueur, who used to be at Aston but has now moved, and they have been collaborating with me on a little bit of research involving a survey and some analysis, which I'll introduce towards the end of the presentation. I should say that my interest in Tritech, I suppose, stems from when I went to Curitiba for the Energep conference a few years ago. And actually we were given the choice of some industrial visits, and I wanted to go to Tritech, but it was full up, and I went to Volkswagen instead. So it's a company I wished I'd been to, because the history of it I found fascinating, and so I've kind of kept track of it since, because of the interesting developments that have taken place. So what I wanted to do is to just very briefly summarise the cases, and then look at a number of different things related to them. The motivation for the acquisition, the motivation on both sides, the financial aspects, the practical aspects. I think it's also important to look at the national policy frameworks, both in Brazil and in China. I have to apologise that if I get anything that's related to Brazil wrong, don't throw things at me, but politely correct me, and I'll make sure that the slides get corrected for any future presentations. And then I'll look at the technology transfer, product development, and quality implications aspects of the 2 cases that I'm discussing. Okay, here's a very brief summary of the Tritech case, and then I'll follow this with a summary of the Volvo case. First of all, and both of them I've got, first of all, the context, and secondly, something about the specific project itself. The context of the Tritech case is that it's actually both the name of an engine and also the name, or was the name of an engine and also the name of a company. Originally designed, the engine was originally designed by Chrysler, and then it was developed into 3 versions. It was created as a company from a joint venture in 1996 between BMW and Chrysler. They both had a need for this particular type of mid-size engine. In the case of BMW, it was for the original Mini being produced in the UK, and for Chrysler it was for the Neon and the PT Cruiser being produced in the US. So in fact the market for these engines was never a local market. It was always an export market, and not even close to Brazil. The finished products were shipped long distances before they were actually installed into cars. I think as far as the context is concerned, we also have to look at a rather messy situation, which was that there was a merger between Daimler-Benz and the Chrysler Corporation in 1998, very shortly after the Tritech company was launched, which meant that actually there was some competition, there was some internal competition going on, because Daimler-Benz, which was had actually taken over Chrysler, was a competitor of BMW. So in one situation they were a collaborator, in another situation they were a competitor. So that put them into rather a difficult situation. In fact, as you probably know, Daimler, that wasn't a very happy marriage, and Daimler withdrew from the Daimler-Chrysler partnership in May 2007. But I think the damage, I think, had already been done in terms of the relationships. Fiat then bought a controlling share of Chrysler in June 2009. Fiat gained full ownership of Chrysler in December 2013, and then a new company called FCA, Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, was established in 2014. So that's a relatively new company, and in fact that's actually registered in the United Kingdom as a holding company for both Fiat and Chrysler. The Tritech project, this starts in 1998 with the initial construction of the plant, completed in January 1999. The first engine was produced in September 1999. The capacity of the factory was 400,000 units per year. It never got anywhere near producing that number of engines. As I previously said, the engines were used in the Neon PT Cruiser and the Mini. BMW sold its stake in Tritech to Chrysler Group in July 2007, partly because of this problem of the relationship between the partners. Then Chrysler tried to sell the Tritech plant because it was no longer using the engine in its own vehicles, and there was a lot of rumoured interest that Chinese companies might buy Tritech. But then eventually in March 2008, Fiat acquired Tritech, and it became part of Fiat Powertrain Technologies, or FPT. So that's a very quick summary of the Tritech case. The Volvo case then, this started, or rather this project, as I said, starts as far as this presentation is concerned in February 1999 when Ford bought Volvo cars from the Swedish Volvo Group. And the intention was to have common vehicle platforms, engineering, architecture and design capacity for a number of different luxury brands. Volvo, Jaguar, that it had already bought in 1989, and also the Lincoln luxury US brand. Ford also bought Aston Martin, but that's way outside the range of the other vehicles, so that was always kept pretty separate, but still part of the still part of what they called the PAG, or the Premium Automotive Group. April 2001, a factory was established in China as a 50-50 joint venture between Ford Motor Company and the Chang'an Automobile Group, and initial production was of the Ford Fiesta Mondeo and also the Maverick SUV. Volvo cars were being made in China, though, from 2006 by Ford in the Chongqing factory in Sichuan, and in 2009 they were producing 8,900 S80s and 6,200 S60s for that particular year. But then in 2010 Ford sold Volvo cars to a company called Zhejiang Geely Holding Group, and that's basically the situation today, and I'll be talking a little bit more about some of the issues to do with that acquisition. So as far as the Geely Volvo project is concerned, Volvo Cars is now Swedish owned, but it retains its headquarters and manufacturing presence in Sweden and Belgium. Ford and Volvo have had to maintain a close component and supply relationship to allow continuity of production, because in the 10 years or so in which Ford owned Volvo, it was very heavily integrated into the Ford supply chain and design networks, and so very difficult to extricate it. So they had to maintain a close relationship initially in order to allow production to continue. Volvo remains officially a foreign company in China, even though it's Chinese owned, because the headquarters are outside China and because the majority of production is outside China. So it's a rather odd situation, and it's not one that a lot of other Chinese acquisitions are like. So in fact, all the plants in China that are related to Volvo are in fact all joint ventures. They have to be a joint venture because officially Volvo is a foreign company, and the law on automotive production in China, which I'll talk about later under the business context, means that automobile production has to be within a joint venture where the foreign owner has no more than 50% of the company. So the situation then is that in 2013 a joint venture assembly plant was opened in Chengdu. and that has plans to export from 2015, from this year. And at the same time, production ceased in Chongqing. Chengdu and Chongqing are quite close together. They're in the same province. So the handover from one plant to the other was facilitated relatively easily. There's also an engine plant in Hebei province, which is a joint venture, and also a second joint venture assembly plant in Daqing in Heilongjiang province, and that started production in 2014, making SUVs. So the motivation for the acquisition, for this I've tried to find the press statements, announcements and so on, which hopefully give a bit of background as to why things happened as they did. So we start off with the motivation for the acquisition of Tritech by Fiat Powertrain Technologies. If we look at the announcement from BMW in July 2007, it's a little bit, it's worded fairly politically, because obviously it's a slightly embarrassing situation. They're in the sort of withdrawing from the joint venture and selling their part of it. They're basically saying that Chrysler Group has now assumed the responsibility for exploring long-term options for the Tritech operations. They may include the sale of the facilities to a third party, which is what started all the rumours about Chinese companies possibly buying them. And they also announced that the engine, the Tritech engine, would be replaced by a different engine made in partnership with the French car maker Peugeot PSA, which is Peugeot Citroën. Then if we look at the announcement by Fiat Powertrain Technologies in March 2008, when it acquired the plant, they were talking about acquiring this plant in Campo Largo, near to Curitiba, enabling them to reach two main strategic goals. First, to attract an even larger number of non-captive customers for the product, that's the engine product, and secondly, to widen the product portfolio, offering a new extremely modern and competitive product range. And they talk about FPT's investments in the Campo Largo plant, expecting to make it into Latin America's major production centre for mid-size engines, satisfying the needs of both local and also export markets. And then if we look at the press comment from Chrysler, who sold the plant to Fiat, they said Chrysler has faced scrutiny over whether it can ride out the downturn in the US auto sales that many analysts expect to stretch through 2009. And the automaker, sorry, this is a press comment on Chrysler. It says the automaker has sold over $500 million of assets, including land around its headquarters and also the Tritech engine. So the underlying motive for selling Tritech was to raise cash. There were other reasons given to do with the technology being outdated, but I think the fact that Chrysler was short of cash and needed to raise cash desperately meant that they sold the plant. I won't say to the highest bidder, but as we'll see later on, it sold it in probably not the best financial condition in terms of their advantage. If you look at the motivation for the acquisition of Volvo cars by Geely, again, I've looked at a couple of press statements and announcements. There's an article here in the UK Telegraph in 2008 that talks about the premium automotive group that Ford had tried to assemble from Volvo, Jaguar, Lincoln and Aston Martin. Basically, he said the whole venture looks nothing short of dangerous hubris. Trouble was, Ford said initially it would keep the products distinctive, but gain synergies in the backroom operations. But it wasn't enough, and they started to share engines, components, floor pans. It all started to go wrong, and it was all, in fact, too late. So what looked like a good idea finished up as being probably a bit of a disaster. I think all the brands suffered as a result of the creation of this PAG group. Ford then, in 2010, said the sale of Volvo will allow us to sharpen the focus on building the Ford brand around the world and continuing to deliver on their new policy, which they called the One Ford Plan, serving customers with the very best cars and trucks in the world. Basically, it was to go back and stick to the knitting, go back to what they knew, which was basically making Ford cars, mass-producing them, and not getting involved in trying to develop individual low-volume luxury brands. And The Economist, about the same time, said it was a failed attempt to build a European-led range of premier marques. It was a drain on both cash and management time. They say that it's true of Volvo, even though it in fact was no longer as bad as it was in the depths of the economic downturn. So when Geely acquired Volvo cars, it wasn't quite as desperate as it had been in the years previously. And what was the chairman of Geely Holding Group saying at the time? He said it's a historic day for Geely. Extremely proud to have acquired Volvo brand, a premium Swedish brand. They said it will remain core to its values of safety, quality, environmental care, modern Scandinavian design, etc., etc., etc. I think that gives you a flavour then of what the motivations were. Certainly on the side of the seller, it was really raising cash. On the part of the acquirers, they're probably quite different, and that's what we'll explore and analyse later on in the presentation. So here's the financial aspects, just in a nutshell. The cost to BMW and Chrysler for establishing Tritech, setting up the company, designing the engine and building the plant was $659 million US dollars. And the cost to Fiat for buying Tritech in 2008 was 250 million reais, so that's my conversion was $150 million. So basically, Fiat bought Tritech for 23% of the original cost. And Fiat's profit in 2008 was 5.1 billion US dollars, so it was kind of a drop in the ocean, really, for Fiat to acquire the plant, and it was really at a bargain price in terms of what they got. If you look at the Volvo situation, the ratios are very similar. Ford paid 6.45 billion US dollars to buy Volvo cars in 1999, and then Geely bought Volvo cars in 2010 for 1.8 billion. So they paid 28% of the original cost. The situation here is a little bit different because Geely's profit in 2010 was only 248 million US dollars. So they had to borrow a lot of money from Chinese banks to acquire Volvo cars. So it really is what would you say, the small fish buying the big one in this situation. With the Tritech case, it's more the case of the big fish swallowing the small one. So quite a big difference in terms of the relationship between the companies. Well, the practical aspect, what did FPT acquire? They got a 1.27 million square metre site with only 31% used, so plenty of room for expansion. They got modern production equipment. They got capacity of 400,000 units per year and a well-regarded engine design, although it was in need of upgrading. That was accepted. And also FPT has a plant in Betim which produces over 1.2 million engines and transmissions each year. And I guess, as everybody in Brazil will know, there's a big assembly plant in Betim producing 740,000 vehicles per year, which my bit of reading this morning told me is the third largest automotive plant in the world, which I think is pretty phenomenal. What did Geely get for their money? They got 2 assembly plants in Sweden, although one was due for closure. That was the Uddevalla plant, which I was talking about earlier on. They got 2 overseas assembly plants, one in Belgium and one in Malaysia, 2 R&D centres, one in Sweden and one in Denmark, a design centre in California, and 3 component manufacturing plants in Sweden. And then in terms of sales, under Ford, they sold 324,000 cars in 2009 for a $12.4 billion revenue. But under Ford, a $662 million loss in that year, which obviously was why Ford was anxious to dispose of Volvo because of it was loss-making along with its other premium brands. But of course, Geely also acquired an iconic international brand, and that was the thing that the press latched onto at that time and was doing all the writing about. Okay, I said I'd look at the national policy framework for both China and Brazil because I think those are particularly important to understand the context of these cases. China's automotive development policy was brought out in 2004 because China had to come into line with WTO obligations. China, however, still regards automotive as what it calls a pillar industry. There are not too many pillar industries. There's 4 or 5 of them. Electronics, telecommunications is another one, for example. So control over ownership is retained. And there's a desire also to develop domestic manufacturers. And as I just said, foreign investment in vehicle assembly is capped at 50%. If a foreign company wants more than 50%, then it has to gear production to exports and be located in an export processing zone. Can't be producing in China for the Chinese market. Component producers, on the other hand, aren't subject to that 50% limit. Also, the number of permitted joint ventures is limited to 2 per category. So a foreign company can't have more than 2 joint ventures making cars or commercial vehicles or motorcycles. And the government also has to issue a license to manufacture vehicles in any particular category. A company can't just go and set up a factory in China and produce cars. It has to be given a license to do so. R&D expenses are tax deductible, and also under the new policy there's a minimum investment size of 2 million Chinese yuan, which is about 300 million US dollars. I'm not sure whether that calculation is right. I need to check it. And then in 2009 the policy was revised, but having said that, there are still concerns that remain about China's commitments as a member of WTO. I think if you know what the WTO rules are and you know what China's doing and what China insists on, there is a mismatch, especially with regard to things like domestic content rules, protecting non-Chinese firms' intellectual property rights, and also technology transfer requirements. What Chinese companies are doing don't seem to be consistent with what normally WTO requirements are. National policy framework in Brazil, this is where you maybe have to put me right if I've got this wrong. There's been a car industry in Brazil since 1925 when Chevrolet built vehicles here. And then there was a policy regulating the industry that was created in 1956, and I won't attempt to pronounce the Portuguese association name. There are no controls on ownership in the same way that there are in China, but there were import restrictions initially, but these were lifted in the mid-1990s. Most of the global companies are now present in Brazil. You only have to go out on the streets out there and you see them all. All the brands are there. The European brands, the Japanese brands, the American brands, the Korean brands, they're all there. There are domestic companies in Brazil, but they tend to be making more for specialised markets. Off-road vehicles, beach buggies and buses is one significant area. And also the Mercosur trade agreement has created a larger regional market for Brazil's automotive industry. And then the latest development has been the Innovar Auto policy from 2013, which incentivizes investments in vehicle efficiency, national production, R&D, and automotive incentives and automotive technology. And that's done through taxes and concessions on industrialized products. And I know that there's been a lot of criticism about Innovar Auto and whether it's creating protectionism, which is actually damaging the industry. But that's an economics argument for a different time, I think. Just looking very briefly at the background behind technology transfer. Why do companies do it? Well, there are basically three reasons for acquiring and transferring technology: for new process and cost reduction, for new products and accesses to new markets, and also for product improvement in terms of both performance and quality. There are a number of reasons ways of achieving technology transfer through transfer of hardware, software and humanware. And as far as the humanware is concerned, that possibly includes expatriate mobility with international transfers. So you've got expatriates moving from the acquirer to the supplier of the technology and vice versa. So if we just look simply at the technology transfer in the Tritech FPT arrangement, what are Tritech bringing to the party? Well, an existing workforce, although much diminished, certainly not the numbers that were originally employed, but there was still a small core workforce with the skills in the company that they were able to bring into the new venture. And of course the existing products, the Tritech engine that had been developed by BMW and Chrysler, that was also bought, and also modern plant. What were Fiat bringing in? They were bringing in market presence because they were already here in Brazil. They were bringing in new products because new car models were also being developed at the same time, and also they were able to bring in know-how related to flex fuel technology engines. And the consequence of that is something called the e-torque flex fuel engine, which has been introduced and being used quite successfully in a number of new Fiat vehicles, not just in Brazil but also worldwide. If we look at the technology transfer in Volvo Geely, what were Volvo bringing in? Well, an existing workforce as well, know-how in particular about quality and reliability, and new production processes. Geely were bringing quite different things. The ability to develop products very fast, which had proved it could do. If you look at the Geely timeline, it's pretty amazing compared with the traditional automotive manufacturer. Mass production techniques, and also politically access to local authorities in China, being able to navigate the minefield of customs departments and all these departments that give you permission to do this and permission to do that. You really have to have access to these bodies in order to get anywhere in China. And the first output was a new plant in Chengdu, making a version of the S60 called the S60L, which was a long wheelbase version. Chinese car buyers like to buy long cars. They like to have lots of room in the back seat. That's because they have chauffeurs. And therefore, if you look at cars that are transferred into the Chinese market, one of the first things they do is to make them longer. GM has done this with a lot of these cars, and Volvo has done it with the S60. If we look at further product development in both of these cases, the e-torque engine has been further developed for use in the 2015 Jeep Renegade, which is being produced at Fiat's new plant that's just been completed. And there's a lot of continuing development of this engine for other 2015 models, the Linnea, the Sienna, and so on. And of course, there's further opportunities for new engines apart from just the engine that they're producing as well. And there are other parts of the powertrain that could be developed. Bearing in mind that there's a plant that's got space to expand, only 70% of, only 30% of the site is being used. So one suspects that there's going to be more development on that side. If you look at further development initiatives in Volvo and Geely, they've now got some joint R&D centres. There's one in Shanghai, a new centre in Gothenburg. The new SUV that's going to be produced in the second plant in China will be the first to have no Volvo components. Since the Geely acquisition up to now, all the components of all the cars have had to rely on Ford to supply components. Volvo also is the first car maker to install hybrid diesel engines in production cars, and Volvo and Geely are engaged on joint research, development and manufacture of electric drive systems for automobiles, and that's the focus of one of the R&D centres, the one in Gothenburg. If we have a look at some of the quality implications, the first thing to remember, of course, is that as far as Tritec and FPT is concerned, FPT or Fiat was buying a component supplier. So it was able to integrate Tritec along the Fiat value chain. And also the context is similar because they're both in the same country. There are cultural similarities. There are language similarities. Well, they're exactly the same language. So much easier to integrate Tritec into FPT. And so a lot of potential to, in fact, increase value along that value chain. If you look at Volvo and Geely, quite different. First of all, they're both final assemblers. We're not talking about the possibility of increasing value along the value chain because there is no value chain as such being created by the acquisition. And also a very different context. Different context geographically, different in terms of language. And so here there's in fact a risk of reducing value rather than a potential to increase value. So red instead of blue. And if we look at it in terms of a gap, the gap between Tritec and FPT is pretty small. BMW and Chrysler were both very well established Western car companies, established in 1916 and 1925. Fiat was established in 1899. They'd been in Brazil since 1976. And in fact, they made the first mass-produced cars to run on ethanol. So in practical terms, the gap is pretty small. They didn't actually have to bridge too much. I mean, I think the only thing they have to bridge is the geographic distance between Curitiba and Betim. But that's still far less than the distance between Gothenburg and Shanghai. The Volvo-Geely gap is much bigger. Volvo was established in 1915, so its history is very similar to the other Western brands. Geely was only established in 1986, and then it was only to make refrigerators. They couldn't get a license to make cars. They got a license to make motorcycles in 1994. They eventually got a license to produce commercial vehicles in 1998. And then they made their first car in 2001. And that was only by borrowing a design for another company in Tianjin. So they've got a very short history as a car manufacturer. And if you look at the difference between Volvo and Geely in terms of the sales income per car, a typical Volvo is selling for something like 34,000 US dollars, and a typical Geely is selling for only about 8,000 US dollars. Geely's made previous attempts to move up the value chain by producing the car on the right. A Rolls-Royce for $45,000 instead of $375,000. As you can probably expect, Rolls-Royce weren't too happy about this situation. It didn't go to court, but the car on the right was very quickly withdrawn and redesigned. And the company actually, well, it probably didn't have a very good name before then, but the name was... Sorry? It was a concept car, but it did appear at the Shanghai. It did appear at the Shanghai Automotive Show. But even as a concept car, I don't think Rolls-Royce were too happy about it. And just kind of wrapping up the presentation on a few slides. I did mention to you earlier that we actually did a little piece of research on the Volvo Geely situation. It was a survey that we conducted in Taiwan, and what we did was to use some factors that customers use when choosing a car, what we call cues, and we used this came from the research that was done by Capgemini, where they looked at the percentage of customers that were saying things were important or very important. And they were saying that reliability was top of the list, followed by safety, followed by the purchase price, followed by fuel economy. So altogether there were 15 factors going down to the financial incentives given by the manufacturer to the buyer. Important just to note at the bottom that Capgemini found that there were only very small differences between the mature and developing markets. Buyers were very similar, whether they were in Western countries or perhaps in Asian countries. So this is the study that we did in Taiwan. We had 136 respondents. The survey was actually done by my Taiwanese collaborator, who I mentioned earlier on. We picked Taiwan because I think it was quite a... Well, I've got a slide which explains why, because there's a lot of cultural similarities between Taiwan and China. It's quite a sophisticated consumer market. It's got its own automotive industry. Customers are therefore pretty well informed. Volvo is a well-established brand. They know about Geely, although Geely aren't sold in Taiwan, but at least they were aware of the company. So it's not a bad place to actually do a small survey of this type. And these are the headline figures, as you can probably guess. What we call the Swedish Volvo came out top in terms of the perception of the respondents in terms of reliability, and what we've called the Geely Volvo came out much lower. When it comes to safety, same thing. Swedish Volvo high, Geely Volvo lower. Price, the Geely Volvo is considered to be more price attractive compared with the Swedish Volvo. Availability, they're suggesting there that a Geely Volvo will be available to a short delivery time compared with a Swedish model, and so on. Then my colleague Michel Lesseur got to work on the numbers and did a few correlation analyses on the results that we got. And you can see that there are some statistically significant correlations across the brands in the middle of the diagram. A high correlation, positive correlation between reliability for the Swedish Volvo and price for the Geely Volvo, and also between safety for the Swedish Volvo and price for the Geely Volvo, and so on. So if we look at the different correlations, it means that there's a theoretical possible future direction for technology transfer between Volvo and Geely, which is to some extent consistent with what they're doing, because they have said that they want to keep the two brands separate and not to damage certainly they don't want to damage the brand of Volvo by having a very strong association with Geely. But on the other hand, we did see that reliability in particular, and also things like equipment options, were desirable extras for the Geely, which could be transferred from Volvo under some technology transfer arrangements between the two brands, which is probably not what the joint venture was, not what the acquisition was intended to do in the first place. Don't think Geely actually saw it necessarily as a way of improving their own vehicles. They probably were, in fact, it was probably more a vanity project, I think, on the part of the owner of Geely in acquiring Volvo and bringing the brand to China. But at the same time, I think the Geely brand itself could, in the long term, benefit, certainly better than developing your own Rolls-Royce. And so we're near the end, and I think Marley wants us to have a discussion, so I've put some points up that we could discuss. What I've suggested are things that you might at least want to think about, even if you don't want to talk about them now, are the similarities and differences between the two acquisitions, Tritech FPC and Volvo Geely. Are there any lessons from the cases that can be applied to the automotive industry in Brazil generally? What are the benefits and risks with technology transfer projects that are illustrated by the cases? How can product development projects be enhanced through the acquisitions that are described in these two cases? What are the principal quality attributes of cars made in Brazil? I think you probably know the answer to that better than I do. And also, what challenges from China may there be in the future? And there I've said, see the numbers. And there are the numbers. So in 2014, Chinese car production went up by 7.3%, and Brazil car production went down by 15.3%. There are some other countries that have dropped as well. I think Argentina's gone down, Russia's gone down, perhaps not surprisingly. Australia's gone down. Sweden went down 4.3% as well, but then Saab has disappeared. So that's perhaps partly accounted for by the disappearance of a whole brand. So those are the numbers and those are the points for discussion. There we go.
Well, let's start. David, in the beginning of the year, the Brazilian automotive industry have a huge crisis, a lot of employment and so on. How do you think it's affected the investments of our case, considering Chrysler and Fiat? And another thing I would like you to discuss is, in Brazil, Fiat is in the top of the market of popular car, but in the premium car, Fiat cannot succeed a model and so on. And I think the partnership with Tritech and Chrysler maybe give the skills to compete in the premium market. What do you think about?
Well, there were two questions. First of all, first of all, to what extent will the situation in Brazil affect the long-term investment plans of the companies? I think automotive companies' investment plans aren't affected by 1 year's numbers. If you look at Volkswagen, when it first set up in China, they had a 25-year time horizon before they expected to be making any money. But they are making a lot of money now because they've been there for more than 25 years. But it takes a long time to get there. I think the important thing is to keep the situation monitored. If the situation in Brazil is only a one-year one, then I think that there isn't likely to be necessarily too much damage to the investment plans of companies, because BMW have just come, haven't they? They've just built a new plant. They won't be turned off by 1 year's automotive statistics. They'll be here for the long game. Sorry? And Geely, yeah, and it's not stopping companies from coming here. I think they can see that in the long term, the Brazilian market, and in fact the whole Latin American market, is almost bound to bounce back, unless anything really catastrophic happens. But I think if anything catastrophic happens in Latin America, it's going to be global. So I don't think Brazil. Well, we all need to be worrying. Your other question was about Fiat and premium brands. Well, I'm only telling you my opinion, but there's nothing wrong in not aspiring to having premium brands. Ford made that mistake. Ford wanted to have its premium brand, and so it made the PAG group, and it bought all these companies, and it all went wrong. There's nothing wrong in actually being a mass-produced, small and mid-sized car manufacturer. So I think I would say that Fiat probably has to exercise a little bit of caution before it actually moved into that sector of the market, because it does very well in the market that it is in. And so it might take its eye off the ball in much the same way that Ford did if they try to develop a premium brand. But that's only a personal opinion. Sorry, but well, yeah, I wouldn't call it. It's not luxury, though, is it? It's yeah, it's. Yeah, but I think it's the right type of vehicle for Brazil, because you can drive it on the beach.
Oh, I enjoyed very much your presentation, David, and I was just comparing. There's a group here that work with the people at Tsinghua University in China.
Yes.
To analyze how government affects spillover effects in FDI spillover effects.
Right. Yeah.
And we compared the automobile industry in China and Brazil. So we are understanding that FDI has direct effects and indirect effects. Indirect effects are not necessarily predefined. They are almost voluntary. They happen.
And they're not always desirable either.
No, not necessarily. I think they are desirable. And it is very interesting because when you compare, especially when you have the slide about the Brazilian industrial policy and the Chinese industrial policy, the differences are huge. The level of intervention that the Chinese government has in regards to enforce spillover are absolutely absent in the case of Brazil. So in China, for you to go to China, a foreign firm, you have necessarily to provide spillovers. This is part of the game. And when foreign firms come to Brazil, they do whatever they want. You know, there is absolutely no imposition of any type of spillover. You know, there is no control. So the contexts are absolutely different. And I think that perhaps China has learned from our mistakes, but it's completely different. You see the numbers that you say, the growth of the production of Chinese cars. Currently, 40% of the Chinese market is supplied by Chinese brands, and we don't have any. We don't have any Brazilian brand in this type of market. So I think that, and I would like to talk to you afterwards, because I think that perhaps if we blend the two papers, we'll have very interesting analysis of what happens.
Well, it's 6 o'clock, and we can talk about this for another 3 hours. But just very briefly, I mean, I would certainly agree with some of what you say, but I think the spillover benefits are spillover benefits for China, but they may not necessarily be spillover benefits for other countries, because the spillover benefit for China might be a loss of intellectual property. To another country, another company or another country.
The rules of the game.
Oh yeah, but well, we'll talk about it later.
Unfortunately, we don't have time online for more questions, but for sure after that we can discuss more. And I would like to acknowledge you for your presentation. It was an honor and a pleasure to have you here. And now I will speak a little bit in Portuguese to finish Bom, então, gente, vou terminar o fórum, já está na hora da gente concluir o fórum. Eu convido vocês, então, para acompanhar os nossos fóruns pelo website do LGP. Em breve, amanhã, já estará a apresentação do David disponível no LGP, que é www.pro.poli.usp.br/LGP. E, provavelmente, nas próximas semanas, o vídeo também já estará disponível. Então, obrigada às comunidades aí do LGP e até a próxima. Tchau.